Take it slowly. German POW women expected the worst when Americans fed them by hand. What happened next changed everything. The war was almost over, but nobody had told the fear that yet. It was the spring of 1945. Across Germany, towns were falling. Roads were full of soldiers walking in the wrong direction, not charging forward anymore, but moving back, giving up, surrendering. The sky over Europe had been smoke and noise for 6 long years. Now, slowly, the guns were going quiet. And in the silence that followed, something strange and unexpected began to happen. Something that no history book would ever fully capture, because it did not happen on a battlefield. It happened at a small wooden table, with a piece of bread, and a young man's hands. Marta was 22 years old. She had joined the Luftwaffe's signals unit 3 years earlier, not because she wanted to fight, but because everyone around her was doing something for the war. She was not a soldier in the fighting sense. She sat at a desk, wore a uniform, received messages, and passed them along. That was her war. That was all she knew of it. She was a quiet young woman with brown hair and careful eyes. She had grown up in a small town near the Rhine River, the daughter of a baker and a schoolteacher. Before the war, her biggest concerns had been whether the bread rose properly in the morning and whether she would pass her language examinations. She had loved autumn, when the leaves on the trees near their house turned gold and the whole world smelled of wood smoke and rain. She had loved Sundays, when her mother read aloud from books after dinner while her father dozed in his chair by the window. Life had been small and steady and very good. The war had taken all of that away from her, the ordinary life, the easy mornings, the sense that tomorrow would look like today. One by one, the small and steady things had disappeared, and in their place came fear, and noise, and the exhausting work of surviving each week without knowing what the next one would bring. By April of 1945, Marta's unit had been pushed westward along with the rest of the retreating German forces. Her commanding officer had been wounded. 2 of the women she worked beside had gone home weeks ago, their papers approved, their faces pale with relief. Marta had stayed, partly out of duty and partly because she did not know where else to go. Home, she had heard, was not safe either. On a cool morning that smelled of wet earth and burning wood, American armored vehicles rolled into the town where Marta and 11 other women from her unit had spent the night in an old farmhouse. There was no dramatic last stand. There was no shouting. The women heard the engines growing louder and closer, and for a moment nobody moved. They all looked at one another across the dim interior of the farmhouse, 12 women in various states of exhaustion, with hollow cheeks and tired eyes, and the look they shared contained everything that needed to be said. Then they stood up, smoothed their uniforms out of pure habit, and walked outside with their hands raised. It was as simple as that. Years of war ended in a few quiet seconds in a muddy yard, with 12 pairs of hands lifted toward a gray spring sky. The soldiers who approached them were young. Marta noticed that immediately. She had expected older men, harder men, the kind of men that the propaganda films back home had shown her. Cold men. Cruel men. Men who would look at her with hatred because she was German, because she had worn a uniform, because she was on the other side of an invisible line that the war had drawn across the world. Instead, she saw boys. One of them had a sunburned nose. Another kept adjusting his helmet as if it did not quite fit. A third one was chewing something slowly, his jaw moving in a relaxed, steady rhythm, as if this were just another Tuesday. They did not shout. They did not threaten. One of them spoke to her in English, and even though she understood very little of the language, she understood the tone. He was asking her something simple. Are you all right? Are there others? The women were taken to a nearby processing camp. It was not a comfortable place, but it was not a cruel one either. There were fences made of wire, a row of tents, and the constant sound of American vehicles moving along the roads nearby. The women were registered, their names written down by a soldier with very small, neat handwriting. Their bags were checked. Their identification was collected. And then they waited. The waiting was the hardest part. Not because the conditions were terrible, but because waiting gave the mind time to move. And Marta's mind moved quickly, filling in the silence with every frightening story she had ever heard. She had grown up being told what the enemy did to prisoners. The stories had been specific and detailed, designed to make surrender feel worse than anything else. Sitting in that enclosure, surrounded by 12 other women who were all thinking the same things, Marta felt the fear begin to settle into her bones like cold weather. She tried to push the thoughts away by focusing on small things: the texture of the ground beneath her, the sound of vehicles on the road outside the fence, the way the afternoon light changed as the clouds moved overhead. Small details, small anchors. It was a technique she had used throughout the war, when the noise and uncertainty became too much. You brought your attention down to something tiny and real, and you stayed there until the larger fear passed. But the larger fear did not fully pass. It just became quieter. None of them slept much that first night. The second day passed. Soldiers walked by the fence periodically. Some glanced in. Most did not. A few times, a soldier stopped and looked at the women with curiosity, not cruelty, just the ordinary curiosity of someone seeing something unfamiliar. One very young soldier waved at them. Nobody waved back. The women sat together and spoke in low voices, reassuring each other with words that none of them fully believed. By the third morning, several of the women were in poor condition. They had been eating very little for weeks before their capture. The retreat had been fast and disorganized, and food had been whatever could be found along the way. A few of the women had been surviving on almost nothing for days. Their faces showed it. Their hands showed it. When they tried to stand too quickly, they had to hold on to something. Marta herself felt a strange, floating lightness that she recognized as her body beginning to give up on itself. She was not dizzy exactly, more like the world had become slightly less solid, slightly less certain. She kept her back straight and her expression calm because she had decided that she would not show weakness. That was the one decision she could still make for herself. On the morning of the third day, the gate of the enclosure opened. American soldiers came in carrying containers of food. Marta saw the steam rising before she understood what she was seeing. The smell reached her a moment later: warm food, real food, something that had actually been cooked. Her body reacted before her mind did. Her hands tightened in her lap. Her eyes moved to the containers and then immediately back to the soldiers' faces, looking for the catch. Looking for the thing that would make this make sense in the way she had been told things would make sense. There was no catch. The soldiers set up a simple table near the center of the enclosure. They brought bread. They brought something warm in a metal container, a kind of thick soup, simple but filling. They brought cups of water. And then, instead of setting everything down and leaving, they stayed. They sat across from the women. And they began to hand the food over, piece by piece, slowly, with the careful attention of people who were thinking about what they were doing. Marta did not move at first. Neither did most of the other women. They watched as if trying to understand a puzzle. A soldier held out a piece of bread toward a woman named Clara, who was sitting closest to the table. Clara was 31 years old and had been a nurse. She looked at the bread. She looked at the soldier. She looked at the bread again. She took it. She ate it in small, careful bites, watching the soldier the entire time. The soldier watched her back, and his expression was not threatening or unkind. It was attentive. It was the face of someone making sure that the person in front of them was all right. Around this time, a medical officer came through the enclosure. He was older than most of the soldiers, with a calm, businesslike manner. He moved from one end of the table to the other, watching the women eat, watching the soldiers serve. He spoke quietly to the soldiers as he went, and Marta, who had been studying English for 2 years before the war interrupted everything, caught a few words here and there. She caught 2 words very clearly. Take it slowly. The soldiers nodded. They already seemed to know. They were tearing the bread into smaller pieces. They were filling the cups only halfway. Between offerings, they waited. They did not rush. They did not pile the food in front of the women and step back. They offered a little, waited, watched, and then offered a little more. Marta did not understand at first why they were doing this. It took her a moment to work it out, and when she did, something shifted inside her that she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe accurately. She understood that the soldiers were going slowly because they were worried about hurting her. She had not eaten properly in weeks. Her stomach had shrunk. Her body had adjusted to almost nothing. If she ate too much, too fast, it could make her very sick. The medical officer knew this. The soldiers, following his instructions, knew this. And so they were being careful, not for any dramatic reason, not as a performance, but because they understood that the kind thing, in this moment, was to go slowly. It was such a small thing. And it was the largest thing Marta had ever experienced. She accepted a piece of bread from a soldier with red hair and freckles across his nose. He could not have been more than 19 years old. He held it out to her and said something in English that she did not fully understand, but the meaning was clear from his face. "Here, take this, it is for you." She took it. She ate it. Nothing bad happened. She looked at the soldier. He gave her a small nod, the kind that means yes, you are okay. She accepted another piece. Over the following days, the pattern continued. Small amounts of food, offered carefully, several times a day. The soldiers rotated, but the manner never changed, patient, attentive, steady. One of them brought a small wooden toy from somewhere and left it at the edge of the table, not as a gift with any expectation attached, but simply because it seemed like a friendly thing to do. Nobody knew quite what to do with it, but nobody moved it away either. It sat there and became, in its small way, a symbol of something that had no name yet. The women began to change, and the change was not dramatic, it was the quiet kind, the kind that happens in the background of ordinary moments. Clara, the former nurse, started eating without watching the soldiers' faces the entire time. She still watched some, but less. An older woman named Hilda, who had refused to speak since the day of their capture, said thank you to a soldier one morning, in English, haltingly, but clearly. The soldier said you are welcome. Neither of them smiled. It was too early for smiling. But something had been placed between them, small and solid and real. Marta noticed that the young American soldiers were not comfortable and relaxed themselves. They were tired. Some of them had dark circles under their eyes. Some of them ate their own rations with the same quiet efficiency of people who had learned not to think too much about food. They were not heroes performing kindness for an audience. They were just young men doing the next thing that needed to be done, which happened to be this, bringing food, going slowly, making sure that the women on the other side of the table were not harmed by the help they were being given. One evening, Marta watched a soldier sit alone near the fence and take out a small, worn book. He held it in both hands and read quietly for a few minutes, his lips moving slightly. She could not see what the book was, but she watched his face as he read, and it was the face of someone at peace, briefly, quietly at peace in the middle of a world that had forgotten what peace felt like. She thought about that face for a long time afterward. Weeks passed. The war in Europe officially ended on the 8th of May, 1945. The news arrived at the camp in a way that was strangely quiet, no celebration, no great noise. Just the information itself, spreading from person to person like something that was too large to react to all at once. Marta heard it and sat down on the ground and looked at the sky for a while. She did not cry. She simply looked up, the way you look at something that has finally, after a very long time, stopped moving. The women were processed further and eventually released in stages, as the administrative systems of a post-war world slowly began to function again. Marta returned to her hometown on the Rhine. She found her father's bakery partially standing, her mother safe, her old life completely and permanently gone. You cannot come back from a war to the same place you left. The place looks the same, but you have changed around it, and everything fits differently now. She married a few years later. She had children and grandchildren. She taught herself to be ordinary again, which is harder than it sounds after extraordinary things have happened to you. She baked bread sometimes, the way her father had, and the smell of it, warm and real and simple, always brought her back to that wooden table in the spring of 1945, and the piece of bread held out to her by a boy with red hair and freckles. She never spoke about those days to her children when they were small. She waited until they were old enough to understand that the world contains both great cruelty and great kindness, sometimes in the same season, sometimes on the same morning, and that what matters most is which one you choose to remember and carry forward. She was interviewed when she was in her early 70s, as part of an effort to collect personal memories from the last living witnesses of the war's final days. The interviewer asked her many questions about her experience as a prisoner in 1945. She answered them carefully and honestly. And then, near the end of the conversation, the interviewer asked her what she remembered most clearly. Marta was quiet for a moment. Not the kind of quiet that means you have nothing to say, but the kind that means you have something important to say and you want to say it correctly. They were afraid for us, she said finally. They slowed down because they were afraid that eating too much, too fast, would hurt us. After everything, after all of it, the thing I remember is that they were afraid for us. She paused and looked at her hands, which were resting in her lap, folded and still. I had been told my whole life that they were the enemy. That word, enemy, it means someone who wishes harm to you. Someone who wants bad things for you. But those young men sat across from us and tore the bread into small pieces so we would not be hurt by it. You cannot be an enemy and do that at the same time. I do not think those two things can live in the same person at once. The interviewer wrote down everything she said. Outside, the Rhine River continued to move in the direction it had always moved. Somewhere, a bakery was warm. Somewhere, a boy with red hair was an old man with grandchildren of his own, probably not thinking about a morning in 1945 when he held out a piece of bread to a frightened young woman who did not know whether to take it. He probably did not think of it as anything remarkable. He probably just thought of it as the right thing to do, the only sensible thing, the thing any decent person would do when they found another human being who was hungry and frightened and in need of care. That is the way it is with the most important moments in history. They do not look important while they are happening. They look like a piece of bread, offered slowly, by someone who was simply paying attention to another human being in front of them. And sometimes, that is enough to change everything.